I'm Steve Davis, the Assistant Curator of the Southwestern Writers Collection, and thank you all for coming today. What I'd like to do is introduce our special guest, Dick Reavis, here. If you can bear with me for a couple of minutes, and if you're still awake when I'm done, then Dick, I promise, will entertain you. It was in 1965 when Dick Reavis was a teenager from Texas. He joined the Civil Rights Movement and went to Demopolis, Alabama, registering people to vote, organizing the community, and so forth. And later on, as a college student at UT Austin, Dick became, shall we say, very active in opposing the Vietnam War. And we're talking about a guy here who voluntarily joined the military in order to organize resistance from the inside to the war. And during his years in the movement, Dick endured beatings, jailings, denunciations, poverty, and all of that, as it turned out, was good preparation for his eventual career, a life in journalism. Dick took up reporting in the 1970s, and the movement's loss was journalism's gain. Over the decades, Dick has built a reputation as a tough and daring reporter. He's won several awards for his investigative journalism. And here's how he has sort of explained his career to me one day when we were talking about this. He said, "I knew Spanish, I knew how to live poor, I knew how to lie to bosses and cops, and I wasn't afraid of anything, and I figured that would give me an edge." Dick's stories over the years illuminate worlds that few mainstream journalists ever come to know. We're not talking about a guy who does celebrity profiles and things like that. Dick really goes behind the scenes and does these really in-depth stories of people who are immersed in what become the front lines of major social issues. Everything from illegal immigration to capital punishment, religious fundamentalism, and the plight of the working class. And there's an autobiographical thread that runs through many of Dick's accounts, chronicling a time when journalism could still be considered an adventure. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Texas Monthly sent Dick to do a story on the Bandito motorcycle gang. And so the first thing Dick did was go out and buy himself a Harley and rode up to New York and joined the club. To Fort Worth and joined the club. Texas Monthly wanted Dick to do an investigative report on the Texas state hospitals for the criminally insane. And so what Dick did is he got himself hired as a patient attendant and then reported on the situation from inside the asylum walls. And for his reporting on illegal immigrants, Dick went down and crossed over. And it was in 1978 when Dick was riding his motorcycle in Austin and a drunk driver in a pickup truck swerved across the center stripe and hit him head on. And just the fact that he survived is miraculous. He was in the hospital for several months, full body cast, the works. And here's what Dick did when he got out of the hospital. He went and he tracked down the drunk driver who hit him and began interviewing him to get his side of the account and put those two together in an amazing story called The Crack Up. Over the years, Dick's reporting has won him many admirers, although the attention is not always limited to literary critics. Last time we checked, the FBI had a 600-page dossier on Dick, and the state of Texas claims mistakenly placed Dick's name on its list of convicted felons. And Dick said he doesn't really complain about these things because it's a great honor to have such detractors. And Dick has been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, a finalist for a National Magazine Award, a longtime senior editor at Texas Monthly. He's now an assistant professor in the Department of English at North Carolina State University. Dick Reavis is also a major donor to the Wittliff collections, and among his holdings here are the extensive papers he acquired while working on his definitive book of the Branch Davidian episode, The Ashes of Waco. We have about 66 boxes of Dick's Waco materials, and our archivist Joel Miner has been working diligently along with other staff to digitize much of the material and make it available on the web. And the Ashes of Waco website includes Joel's interview with Dick and information on about 500 or so key items in the archive there, which include photos and video, transcripts of the 911 calls, David Koresh's manuscripts, all sorts of kind of fascinating information. that Dick acquired as he was doing his research for that book. Dick's archives here also contain many other important pieces, notably his records from 1987. Remember that year? This was the year that Dick spent driving every single road in Texas for Texas Monthly. So we have slides, notes, the annotated maps, scrapbook, and many hundreds of postcards. And Joel and I were talking about this earlier, and Joel said that really what you have here is you have this wonderful kind of snapshot of Texas in 1987 that's preserved through what Dick did, just basically going to every town in the state. Dick's the author of several books, and they include The Ashes of Waco, Without Documents, Conversations with Montezuma, Ancient Shadows Over Modern Life in Mexico, and If White Kids Die, Memories of a Civil Rights Movement Volunteer. And this newest book is Catching Out, The Secret World of Day Laborers. And this again shows the difference between how Dick approaches his craft as a journalist and how most journalists were accustomed to do things. From what I can tell, the journalists in America fall into kind of two different categories. And one is the journalist who covers politics or sports or civic affairs. And these are people who hang out, in that crowd and gain really great insight into the inner workings of the legislature or the basketball team or city government or whatever. So all this inside knowledge, but these people also are very concerned with protecting their sources and perhaps not embarrassing people who become their friends. And so as readers, when you read the reporting, you really don't get a sense of what life is like on the inside of those worlds or what's really going on at these levels. So you get people basically perpetuating the views of the officialdom in these cases. And then there's the kind of journalist who sort of gets parachuted into these unfamiliar situations. And these could be anything from the disaster in Haiti to, say, a meth lab explosion out in Wimberley. In these cases, the reporter comes in with the officials, finds people to interview, and then chooses which quotes best support the official version of what happened. And that's not how Dick works. He works from the inside out. And for him to write about day laborers, as he's done here, he couldn't just sort of go into this day labor hiring facility and start asking people questions. He went to work, and catching out is the result. And like much of Dick's journalism, catching out isn't trendy or fashionable, but it does have that honor of being the rare form of journalism that really has staying power. A lot of the work that Dick's done, there's really nothing more boring than going back and looking at last week's newspaper or a newspaper from 3 years ago. I mean, you may find some interesting things, but a lot of the stories that Dick's done over the years, really, if you read them today, you realize that you're reading basically a history text. And what's interesting to me about Dick is that he really does kind of peer behind the veil of our society. We're distracted by so many contemporary events. He goes kind of behind that and shows us really, the very first take, what's really historically important about what's happening today. And he's basically a historian who works in the present. And so for us, it's a real honor to have Dick's archives here, and it's a great honor to have him here in person. So please join me in welcoming Dick Reavis. Thanks.
Today I usually think of myself as a frail old man. I listen to him and I remember that I was once young. I want to start today by, Steve showed me this morning, somebody defaced one of the posters announcing my arrival. It now says Catching Jose, which is a testament to the persistence of certain attitudes on behalf of my people. And by my people, I mean white folks in Texas. I'm one of them. But I saw something else in it. When you mention day labor today, and some of y'all may want to leave after I say this because you may be here to hear about a different subject. When you mention day labor, people think you're talking about the Latino immigrants who stand outside Home Depots and stand on street corners. And I think that that's because in the last 40 years, we as a nation have made great progress, and we are now sensitized to racial and ethnic issues. But at the same time, in the last 40 years, we've gone backwards on class issues. The book I wrote is about a group of workers. It doesn't matter what color they are, who nobody sees. Because we're all looking at wealth these days and not what makes it possible, which is plain hard work. And my book is not about the Latino day laborers, though I'm going to talk about them a bit. Oh, to give you another example, the picture on my book, if you could see the whole picture, the guys at the top are Mexican immigrants. They sent it to me and I said, hey, that's the wrong group of guys. Didn't you read my book? So they cut it off halfway. There are today in most American cities Latino immigrants who stand on street corners and in front of Home Depots and places like that, trying to catch out, which means get a job good for a day or a couple of days, especially in construction and landscaping. That's where they're hired. They make about $10 an hour. In any given year, 40% of them are stiffed, meaning the employer takes them to the work site, they work, and when the job is finished, which could be that day and it could be 3 or 4 days, the boss man says, I got to go to the ATM machine to get some cash to pay you guys. He doesn't ever come back. About 40% of them get stiffed each year on at least one job. That's what the surveys show. The other thing about the Latino day laborers is that if they're on a job and they get hurt, what typically happens is the boss man puts them in his pickup, drives to an emergency room, and pushes them out the door. And he's gone. Because the hiring process is paperless, the workers don't even know his name. They may know a name he's given them. They're usually not sure what company they're working for, if there is a company, and it's just exploitation of the rawest kind. Now, the good thing about this is that in 2005, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations financed a couple of big-time sociologists who hired 300 graduate students to go out and survey these Latino immigrants and to map the places where they work. There's now a map that'll show you every street corner in the United States. Wonderful sociological work. And they found that there were 117,000 of them. The same sociologists, they're specialists in what's called contingent labor, study the guys I wrote about who work out of labor halls. Because of immigration, how do you say, when you go get a job today, it's probably happened to most of you, you got to convince the employer that you have work papers. So Social Security number, driver's license, blah, blah, blah. Because of that, most of the people who do day labor out of agencies are legal in this country, and most of them are citizens. They're mostly brown and black, I'd say 15 to 20% white. In the Southwest, they tend to be brown. In the South, they tend to be black. And they make about $2 an hour less than the Latino day laborers. We know this much about them. The advantages are they have workman's compensation, meaning if you get hurt on a job, there's a procedure set up for paying you for your injuries. If you get sick, if you get pneumonia, something like that, well, there's no medical insurance, but if you get hurt on the job, there's some protection. And the second thing is day laborers never get stiffed because we're protected by contracts. If you'll pick up a phone book and look under employment temporary, you'll find a list of day labor halls. I don't know if San Marcos has any. Austin's got a dozen. some of which are operated by transnationals and national chains. Adecco is one of them. It's transnational. It's European. Labor Ready in this country, Volt, Aerotech, used to be Manpower. Those of us who are old know Manpower. Manpower is now gone only into providing contingent labor in white-collar settings and highly skilled settings. All of y'all have seen this. You've known an IT worker who was working for a company without benefits, but under a contract that paid him X number of dollars. Okay. I'm talking about the guys who work out of the labor halls and the agencies, who show up about between 5:30 and 6 o'clock every morning, hoping to catch out for the day. The experts in contingent labor have not been able to study them because there's no funding. 8 years ago, the GAO issued a report, the Government Accounting Office or Accountability Office, whichever it is, and said it had checked with the Labor Department and nobody knows how many of them there are, and it hadn't been studied since. The GEO's estimate is that there are 800,000 to 2 million, far more than the count of the Latino day laborers. So there are far more essentially citizen types doing this kind of precarious work, but nobody knows much about it. The one statistic we have that's good is that there are about 22,000 day labor halls in the country. Okay. I'm asking is $6 to $8. Now about $6.50 to $8, but it don't make that much difference, right? So what if one guy's paying you 15 cents an hour more? And the dispatchers will select a group of you to do the job in which one of you has a car, or maybe two of you. Most day laborers do not have cars, and that's one reason they're in the labor hall. So you ride to work with a coworker, and you pay him $5 to $7 a day for the ride to work and back. So right there, if you're working an 8-hour day, you done lost an hour paying for transportation. Now, the guy who's driving the car makes out pretty good. But you go to work, and very often, the dispatcher didn't really know what he or she was sending you to do. And you didn't know, and when you get out there, you find it's something you haven't done before, or, how do you say, you have to figure out the job almost every day. And you do whatever you're told. I did landscaping, did construction cleanup, did demolition. In the shopping centers, most of the stores and shopping centers are chains. When new merchandise comes in on the truck, the people who work there don't unload it. They call the labor hall. So we unloaded at shopping centers, and you'd unload the boxes, bring them inside, cut them open, take the contents out, and then the employees would put them on the shelves. I drove cars at an auto auction. If you've ever been to an auto auction, somebody has to drive those cars into the auction ring or the auction barn, and then has to put them back on the parking lot. I did that. I cleaned up the apartment for about a week of a dead pack rat because his heirs didn't have time to go through all that stuff. And I dug holes for trees, worked with a man who was blind, a day laborer who was blind. All sorts of jobs. I worked in a culvert factory. Y'all know what culverts are? If you look, especially in the country where there's a little bridge, there are these steel tubes underneath them. Well, somebody got to make those steel tubes. And I worked in a factory that did that. I did this 2 summers, 2007, 2008. First 3 weeks, I hurt constantly. I think it's like basic training or something. Because I wasn't in physical shape. After those 3 weeks passed, it was fun. That's the longest story, but I enjoyed my work and it was healthy. I enjoyed my companions and the work was interesting. Manual labor is not boring, at least if you're going to a new job every 2 or 3 days, because you're learning something new. And manual day labor gives you a chance to see the inside of enterprises you wouldn't ever see, even as a reporter. What reporter's ever been in a culvert plant? Doesn't happen, right? Driven cars in an auction ring. We cleaned up after a big rock concert, and part of our job was putting away the booze that hadn't been sold. Now, there are a lot of people who would like to be in our shoes that night. I don't drink, but a lot of people would like to have been there. But you see a world that generally we just drive by and don't even know is there. And it's a world we couldn't live without. A reporter just sent me a question about why did I even think it was important. And I says, well, if I told you it wasn't, it'd be like saying water treatment wasn't important. When you go to the faucet, you don't think about water treatment, but by golly, if somebody wasn't out there working, you might be sick. So that's what labor is. And one of the things I liked about day labor, and I don't talk much in the book in my feelings, but I think I do say this. On the day labor job, everybody knows what your attitude is. Meaning, you don't get the questions like you get in career and white collar jobs. Oh, why do you want to work for us? Common question. You're supposed to say, because I believe in the mission of your company or your bureaucracy, right? You can't say, because I got to pay bills, right? There's a great deal of hypocrisy in white collar life. You got to show up kind of cheerful every morning and say good morning to everybody, how are the kids? And you got to try to get along and look presentable. Day labor, they know what your attitude is, and they're just hoping you don't steal from them, show up drunk, or pull a knife on them. And that is a very comfortable relationship to have with an employer. Ain't no Tomming. Y'all may not understand that word, but Tomming is what, in the civil rights movement, when there were black people who would not get in the movement and who were always helping the whites, we would say, now I didn't say, but the black organizers would say, he's a Tom or she's an Aunt Mary, meaning they're kissing the rear end of the white folks. Well, one of the things that white folks do is Tomming. Only they're Tomming to their economic superiors, their bosses. Y'all understand the point I'm getting? When you laugh at the boss's jokes, you're Tomming. On day labor jobs, they ain't no Tomming. They know what you think of them, and they think you're scum of the earth. And you just sort of accept that, and you have freedom. And you know, everybody knows what the score is, and that's real comfortable. So I enjoyed it. I enjoyed my companions, partly because I was 62 when I started, 63 when I finished. I was the oldest guy around, thanks to my prior life, some of which Steve described. I've got a bum knee, and I've got COPD from 35 years of 3-pack-a-day smoking. I'm not the best physical specimen, and there were some guys who looked out for me. They call me Pops, because I always talk to the Latino workers on the jobs we were at, meaning on any job there are Latino workers, and I would talk to them and we would speak in Spanish. And I talked to them just because I like talking to them. And they nicknamed me Abuelito. And my day labor comrades were saying, what's that they keep calling you? And I said, Pops. And the name stuck. And I became Pops from then on because I was the oldest guy in the labor hall. But that in itself says something. What I learned is that if you do hard labor, by the time you're 65, you've got a bad shoulder, a bad knee, or a bad back. I say 65, 55. You're pretty much crippled at 55. You ain't got much left in you. And our retirement system says that at 62 you can take early retirement. So the manual laborer in this country is looking at 7 years of starvation is what it comes to, because when your body goes, there's nothing you can do. I'm reminded of the old saying, the law in its majesty prohibits both the rich and poor from sleeping under bridges. And so day laborers who are above 50 get to talking, and they say, I'm hoping to get disability. When is that going to happen? That is their hope, disability, not Social Security, because they get broken down. That's what day labor does to you. In the book, I refer to a pick, right? Pickle, as a machine that causes lower back injuries. That is just as much true as smoking cigarettes cause emphysema. If you work with a pick for long, you're going to have lower back injuries. It is a dangerous tool. And we don't see it that way, because our laws aren't written by the people who have to use it. But people got broken down, and here I was, they didn't know why, older than anybody else, able to still keep going. I was older than anybody else because I had a white-collar life. I mean, I was able to do something at 62 because I'd had a white-collar life. But it still wasn't up to par. And on every job that was hard, there were guys who looked out for me because they believe everybody has a right to a job. And they would take, like one time I had to pick up a bag of cement that weighed 80 pounds and throw it into a dumpster. Dumpsters are 6 feet high. I'm not quite that tall, right? A 6 feet guy, he can do it easier than me. And I looked at it and I tried to pick it up, and another guy sees me and he comes over and, like what's his name? Michael Jordan doing a basket. For him it was nothing. They looked out for me. Today in day labor there are also females, maybe 15%. The day labor halls try to send them to women's work jobs, right? Office cleanup, cafeteria lines, that sort of thing. But there are not always enough of those jobs to go around, and sometimes the women would wind up on the construction jobs with us. And I thought that the men would despise them and avoid working with them, but it's not true. Because, for example, on sheetrock, it comes in 4x8 sheets. Now, if it's ½ inch or thicker, it comes in 4x8 sheets that are taped together at their ends, 2 sheets at a time. And if it's a ½ inch or thicker, it weighs 80 pounds, those 2 sheets. One guy on each end to move it. If the women on the crew, who are about my size usually, are a little smaller, you cut the sheets that are holding those sheetrock sheets together, and you carry one at a time, 40 pounds at a time. There ain't a day laborer out there who isn't happy to do that. So that the women's presence sometimes makes the physical labor easier for the men, and that's why they don't resent the women being around. The other thing is that because, at least in the locale where I worked in North Carolina, most day laborers are black, there is a certain amount of solidarity on that basis too. When we were driving the cars at the auction barn, there was a lady driving. She skidded into a fence. She said, and I saw it happen, could have been true. She said she hit the brake and the gravel was too thick or something, and that made her skid. As far as I'm concerned, that was good enough. But the foreman, who was white, said, no, you hit the gas when you were trying to hit the brakes. Now, we were all driving cars we'd never been in before. That could have happened as well. And he starts into her, and it's clear that he's going to fire her. And about a minute later, he's surrounded by 10 day laborers, all of whom is black but one. That foreman discovered mercy right there on the spot. And the lady was not fired. And I asked a couple of my coworkers, I said, what do you think happened? And they said, well, the foreman's making up that stuff. And I said, what if he ain't making it up? And they said, everybody needs a job. They understood that the position of those women, most of whom were single mothers, was desperate. And they didn't care if you were old like me and white like me, or if you were black and female. They didn't care. They understood everybody needs a job. I only wish our educated people were so wise as they were. Should watch my watch. How long have I been talking? I'll tell you a story about our hero. Day labor halls are like anywhere else. People have different personalities. We had a guy in our hall, and in fact, that's why I chose the hall. I'd heard about him before I went there. My first summer, he wasn't there. He was in jail. But when he came back, he stood, this was a guy who stood 6'3" to 6'5", and was built. I'm looking for something heavy. This I might be able to carry by myself. He could grab it under one arm. And he called his specialty unloading moving vans, where you got chest of drawers and couches and stuff, which he could handle better than anybody. And he liked moving vans because it doesn't take usually more than 4 or 5 hours to unload one. And usually the people in the house that you're unloading at, they give you a tip, 20 bucks or better. So it paid better, less hours, it paid better than most other work. Can't blame him for declaring himself a specialist on those grounds. And I want to warn you, if any of y'all ever move, I don't know about, I'm not so sure about moving away, but moving in, you're going to have a van show up with 5 or 6 workers who have T-shirts with the name of the moving company on them. They gave them those T-shirts after they showed up from the day labor hall. And we were 2 or 3 times dressed up as regular employees, right? And we got to keep the T-shirts. Anyway, this guy, his name was Real Deal. He had been at the labor hall 11 years, longer than any of the managers. When he came in the morning, he'd be shaking hands with everybody, like he was a U.S. Senator come to visit us. And then he'd go up to sign in, and he'd sign in, and he'd say, do the math. And I don't know why he said that, but everybody would say, do the math. And then he'd sit down in a corner, and there was a certain crowd of guys who'd start moving their chairs to be near him. And they'd tell tall tales and talk about drinking bouts and just generally carrying on, having a good time. And I think we all looked to him for leadership. Partly because he was big and able and experienced, and partly because you're dealing with a male blue-collar crowd largely, partly because he could outdrink anybody. We didn't drink on the job. I won't tell you that while we were riding out to the job, people didn't drink. And between the job and the day labor hall to get paid at the end of the day, there's only 2 or 3 of us who didn't drink. I was one of them. I don't drink at all. But alcohol's pretty common, so are cigarettes. And one day we were out on spreading asphalt. Asphalt trucks are heated. When the asphalt is put into them, it's hot and they are heated as they drive. Because if the asphalt gets cold, it clumps up. You can't spread it out, it lumps up. We've been doing this, tearing up pavement and putting down asphalt all day. And about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, well, the rain starts falling. Then a cold wind starts blowing. And the asphalt starts lumping up on us. We're having trouble spreading it. So Real Deal tells the foreman of the company we're working for, we can't keep this up. It's getting too cold. And the foreman starts arguing that we can. And it turns out we had one guy on the crew who had worked asphalt for like 8 years. And he starts explaining the techniques of the technical stuff about why we can't. This asphalt's supposed to be so many degrees. I know, I've worked with it. It's only so many degrees. Don't BS me. Before I went to prison, I worked 8 years on it, right? And so Real Deal said, well, we can't do it, we're going home. And the foreman says, oh no, there's still 2 trucks coming. And the rain's getting heavier. And Real Deal says, I told you we're not doing it. And he walks over in the grass and lays down this way. Lays down on his back and spreads his legs. And the rest of us look at him. We put down our tools. And the foreman gets on his little telephone and talks to another one of them. And there's a series of conferences, and they come over 5 or 6 minutes later and they say, okay, you can go home, we'll sign the tickets. So he led us in what you'd call a job action, I guess. But he didn't always do that when we were in that situation, and I never figured out why. We had a couple weeks later, we were on a job where they didn't give us water. And a worker went to him and he said, why don't you bring us some water? Bring us a cooler of water. And the boss man said, where would I get it? The worker said, from Lowe's. And enough of us were circling around that the boss did go get a cooler and put it out. We all go over to drink out of it. And there was no ice in it. It was 90 degrees out there. And so the worker said, somebody, you ought to put ice in it. Boss man whips out his cell phone, calls the labor hall. Such and such worker has given me lip. Passes the phone to the worker. The labor hall says, he wants you fired and we can't come get you to 3 o'clock. So if you don't give in, you're going to be sitting until 3 o'clock and not making any money. Well, I thought this was time for us to throw down our tools again. But I was not the leader. Real Deal was. Nobody would have followed me. And Real Deal, I think, was getting along with the foreman because the foreman had given him some leave. Even Real Deal had back problems. But anyway, he didn't say nothing. And we missed the opportunity, and the worker had to give in and keep working. We had to drink lukewarm water. Anyway, one afternoon, Real Deal comes in the labor hall, and he's sitting over there in the corner. And we had a dispatcher who was known in the hall as son of Rush Limbaugh. Now, when black people say, give somebody that nickname, they're telling you something, right? And Real Deal, his crowd are shucking and jiving, waiting to get paid. And son of Rush Limbaugh tells them to shut up. So they do. But it's boring in that labor hall. So about a minute later, they're back at it again. And son of Rush Limbaugh tells them to shut up again, and they go quiet again for maybe 2 minutes this time. And then he tells them a third time. The Real Deal stands up, starts giving lip to the dispatcher. The dispatcher picks up the telephone, calls the police. Real Deal walks out to the front porch. He's leaving the hall. The man's telling him to get out. I'll call the police. You're going to be arrested. When he gets out on the porch, Real Deal stops there. He's waiting to see if they're going to make him get off the grounds or if his buddies will come join him or what happens next. And here come 3 police cars. And he fights them. Took 5 cops to get him into the car. Of course, he's back in jail again. I checked his jail record. Until that arrest for assault on a police officer, Real Deal had been arrested 39 times in 11 years. I admit that's quite a bit. The other 38 times were for public drunkenness. He never hit anybody. He never stole nothing. He just liked to drink 211, which is sort of a potent version of beer. So he was a harmless guy who, when he wasn't at work, tied one on until that happened. And afterwards, we still had a labor hall. We still caught out. And in the mornings, it was silent. And in the afternoons, we were waiting to get paid. And every one of us missed him. He got out of jail. He's now in a labor hall. Some of his old cronies are over there with him. And they're still carrying on the way they did at ours. It's a perpetual thing for them. If I can say one last thing, it's this. I don't know how many, but a lot of the men I work with were ex-convicts. When they were younger, I mean, the ex-convicts on the day labor crew tend to be 35 to 45. I looked up their jail records. I heard them talking about it. You know, when I'd hear them talking, I'd go home in the afternoon, get on the computer and find out what they'd been up for. They were in jail, most of them for selling drugs in the 90s. They've been out 5 or 6 years. They have wives. They have children. They show up for work every day. Some of them are real good workers. They looked out for me. I never had no trouble with them. But because prison records are now on computers, if you're a human relations person, human resources person, and you got one applicant who doesn't have a prison record and another who does, you know which one you're going to hire. So these guys, because of a mistake they made when they were 18 or 19 or 20, are looking at a lifetime of $6 to $8 an hour when there's work. I made $800 to $1,000 a month. If I'd had a car, I could have doubled it. And that would have been the best thing I could have done, $2,000 a month. With one little exception, and every one of you should worry about this one. If there's 60 to 100 men in a day labor hall, there are the same number or more who came out of the day labor hall who only come back to it once a week to get paid because they've been assigned to permanent jobs as day laborers. And what that means is, like at the Colbert factory, they wanted to keep me. They were having to pay $15 an hour for me. I was getting about 7. Labor hall's taking the difference. They wanted to keep me for as long as I wanted to stay. And what they would have done is call the labor hall and said, we want to keep Mr. Reavis, but we can't afford that $15 a month, the $15 an hour. And the labor hall would have said, if you'll promise to keep him 6 months, we'll let you have him for 10. Right? And the employers like this because there's no medical insurance for me, there's no vacation time, there's no sick leave. And the labor hall handles all the taxes and the bookkeeping. It is turnkey labor. And if they can get it cheap enough, they'd rather have me than a regular employee. And if they find out I'll show up every day. On one job I was on, we were working in a schoolhouse doing ducting for our air conditioning heating system. We were there 3 days before we found out that everybody on the job except our foreman was also day laborer. Only they've been doing it for 6 months. Okay, when there's an economic downturn, day laborers are the first people to lose their jobs. When ours hit in 2008, construction went flat, and that was 30% of my labor hall, 30% of the work. Labor halls all over the country closed, those who had a lot of construction work, and others like mine quit taking applications. But when an upturn starts, the employer says, things have been looking good the last 6 weeks. Maybe I ought to bring back some of the people I laid off. And one of his associates says, if you do that, we have to put them back on the payroll, and if things turn down again, we have to take them off the payroll and pay unemployment benefits and big hassle, right? So instead they call the labor hall, because there's no unemployment problem, none of that, no unemployment insurance problem for them. It's the labor hall who's the employer by law, and who must take care of that, not the employer. So they call the day labor halls, and they try to replace payroll workers with day laborers. If you think it's a minor phenomenon, Japan, which in 1990 was the country of lifetime employment, in that country, 1/3 of the workers are now contingent because they went through that 10 years of lost decade. So that day labor is a threat to any of y'all who have a regular job, at least a lot of you. And the only solution is, and I don't think we're going to adopt it, is what they did in Europe. In Europe, they outlawed day labor, about 1948. 2000, they re-legalized it. Under these provisions, the day laborer gets paid whatever the person he's replacing got paid, or whatever the industry standard for the work he's doing is. Secondly, the day labor hall has to provide him with health and vacation and sick leave benefits. Now, if you pass a law like that, which the European Union did, day labor becomes not a way to launder workers or to hire cheap workers. It becomes like renting a car. If you really only need it temporarily, you know you're going to have to pay through the year. Ain't that the way it is renting a car? You're going to have to pay a premium. So you don't do it unless it's really temporary. And that forces those employers to put the temps onto the payroll and give them benefits. That would help day laborers more than anything, because all of a sudden, even if they had prison records, blah, 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 they would have permanent jobs. I don't think that's going to happen because, as I've told you, nobody cares. I don't have anything else to say. I'll take questions for a while, I guess. Yeah.
I was curious about unsafe work practices, day laborers, and injuries that come as a result of not being trained for the jobs they're there to do.
You know, it's a problem because the labor hall doesn't necessarily know what you're really going to be doing when you get out there. They'll give you safety equipment if they know. But they don't necessarily know. The safety equipment they have is sometimes no good. In my labor hall, if you said you didn't have steel-toe boots, they would give you some rubber boots which had steel toes. And that ain't too good for some jobs. So I always told them I did. Right? And working at the covert plant, I dropped something on my foot and couldn't walk for 10 minutes. Right? And the guys in that plant had special shoes, which cost $200 a piece, which ain't no day labor going to come up with, right? If you get hurt, the smartest thing to do is if you can make it to work, or if you can lay out a couple days, don't say nothing. Because the labor hall, you don't want them thinking you're injury prone. Does that make sense? And keep your mouth shut. One time I reported an injury because I was mad at the foreman. I thought he was negligent. And they had me fill out a form and they said, do you need to see a doctor? I guess for first aid. But generally, I never saw an OSHA inspector on any job. I saw elevator inspectors, but you see, they're backing up the insurance companies and the owners. An OSHA guy I never saw. On one job I called OSHA, I was working with what's called an open auger. And the OSHA guy said, open augers are always illegal. I said, how quick can you get out of here? He said, it'd be 6 weeks at the soonest. So I just didn't go on the labor hall the next day. Let them send somebody else to do my job. But that's no solution, right? Generally speaking, the protections workers have are much weaker now than they were when they were enacted. That's what's happened to our country in these years. We're better off than the Latino workers because we got some protection, but it ain't much. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you, now that you've gone through the experience and worked with those guys, did you ever reveal that, your other life, or with the book coming out, and are they at all aware that their stories are represented?
I have no idea if they're aware. I doubt it, because they ain't big readers. And I don't think my dispatchers and those people are big readers. And while I was doing it, only the head of my department, my wife, maybe 2 friends knew. Because I didn't want the labor hall figuring that out. I mean, I used my real name, which is a change for me, and used my real ID, not somebody. In the old days, I had a driver's license with my picture on it, and other names. It was a felony, but. In the old days, it's getting harder to do. Well, it's not that hard. For $200, I could have got fake papers, but I use my own stuff. But as far as I know, there's no one knows.
I have a question about, in a situation where an employer says, I want this individual worker for an extended period of time, and they cut a deal, is there not a time limit in which you can only have that worker work for so long before you have to either put them on payroll?
No, it's the opposite. The contract will say that the employer cannot put you on payroll until you've been there like 3 months, or some places 6 months. But if the employer doesn't want to put you on payroll, if he wants to keep you working for the day labor agency, there's no limit. And I talked to a guy on an airplane a couple of weeks ago. He got to talking to me, another redneck type like me, And I told him I'd written a book, and he said, what's it about? And I said, day labor. And he says, oh. He said, I got 5 employees who are day laborers. And I got to talking to him. He told me they were all white. And I thought that was funny, because it's hard to find 5 white workers on one group, because white workers are the minority. I said, how did you get 5 white workers out of the day labor hall? He says, well, I hired them myself. And then I told them, go sign up with the labor hall, and then you can start working for me. And I said, why did you do that? He says, well, if I got to lay them off, there's no unemployment. That's the labor hall's problem. I ain't got no paperwork, blah, blah, blah. Told me he was paying $20.18 an hour. But that sort of laundering of workers is now becoming a mass phenomenon. And because it works to the employer's advantage.
Is anyone addressing that?
There's something called the National Labor Employment Law Project. I think it's 4 lawyers in New York. Look them up on the web. The unions in New York City are now crusading to get the city to quit hiring day laborers.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Where does it need to start? Where does that action need to start? Would it be at the city level? Would it be, writing your legislators, your congressmen?
I think to succeed, it has to start with the AFL-CIO and congressmen, right? I mean, one person writing a congressman, they're going to lay it down to their contributors list. Now, if you're one of them big contributors, they're going to listen to you. But, I mean, the Roosevelt administration tried to bring labor agencies under regulation. Francis Perkins, the labor secretary, held hearings all over the country and wanted a national law passed to regulate it, but it got stopped. And it ain't been picked up since then. In fact, it's gone backwards. At that time, labor halls were subject to some regulation as employment agencies. But in the 60s, Manpower went and got all the state legislatures to reclassify labor halls as suppliers of labor services rather than employment. So they're service providers and they're outside of regulation. And they just went state by state and did that. So it's got to be done legislatively. It could be done on the state level, right? All states could set up regulatory commissions. And I certainly think they should, just so they know who is renting workers, right? Who's in the business. But they don't even know today. I mean, there's no registry. So that's where it would have to start. But, you know, maybe if we... I want to say why the AFL-CIO was crusading against it. In a lot of cities, the garbage men are city employees and therefore have certain benefits, retirement, sick leave, and so on. But in most suburban communities, it's private companies picking up the garbage and it's using day laborers to do it. And it's tough work. 500 trash cans a day, 5 to 7. That's tough. You got to jump up and down that truck all day. And if it's raining, you still got to do it, right? Tough work. One of the guys I knew got laid off from one of those companies after 2 years. And he had gotten a couple of raises. He was a day employee of the day labor hall all this time. And he was happy as he could be, bragging to me that in the last year he had made $24,000. Now that's what happiness is to a day laborer. It's sad. Another woman, a woman in her 50s, used to sit next to me a lot. I think because we're both white and she was single. But who knows? Maybe I'm complimenting myself. One day she was telling me, I had a dream last night. I dreamed that I found $10 in my jean pocket. That's what day labor hall is, where people have dreams about finding $10. Something needs to be done, right? Poor lady. But I don't know of anybody who's proposed it right now other than the unions in New York City. And that I learned after I wrote the book.
What kind of cut does the hall get out of the workers' pay?
It's roughly double. If you're making 7 an hour, they're probably getting 15. If you're making 8, they're probably getting 18, 19. Roughly double on a day labor deal. Now, when you go essentially permanent, labor hall drops its take because it's just automatic, right? And you as a day laborer have to make one concession. They only have to pay you once a week. But to simplify the labor hall's paperwork. But at the day labor basis, 100%. At the permanent basis, it can be awful thin margin because all the labor hall's really doing is doing the paperwork, right? They don't even see you. They don't supervise you. I mean, there's nothing there. Yeah.
How many days would you show up at 5:30, 6 o'clock and then not get it that day? How long would you have to stay?
I'm going to say that, now during one period, because I have a bad knee, I had to be gone every Tuesday to get shots in my knee. But in good times, you're going to catch out 4 days a week, maybe even 5. In bad times, 2 or 3. And if you're really young or really gung-ho, we had one woman there who would work, let's say, 7 to 3 on one job, come in the labor hall, get paid in 3, and say, you got any night work? And so some people working 12 hours, some of them 16. And then we had a lot of people who had like graveyard shift jobs in warehouses, would come into labor hall when they got off their regular job and try to pick up at least 4 hours in the labor hall. Because one thing I discovered is that in the blue collar today, if you're making ends meet, it's because you're getting 10 hours of overtime or have 2 jobs, one or the other. Nobody's making on 40 hours. And on the jobs where we would work, the regular workers would brag to me, like at the culvert plant, hey, you ought to go to work here, this is a good job. We get 55 hours. And it's just rampant. One of the reasons there's more overtime is that it's cheaper to hire, let's say, 3 guys at 60 hours a week, paying them time and a half, than it is to hire 1 and pay benefits. And it's because of this medical insurance problem. So most regular employees on blue-collar jobs have an opportunity to get overtime, and they need it. And they brag about it. I only worked 5 days. There was also work on Saturdays if you wanted it, but I didn't come in. Yeah.
What kind of housing situation do most people have?
Almost all of them have a room, which usually means I'm living in my brother's house, my mother's house, or my aunt's house. That's pretty standard. We might have had 10% of the guys live in homeless shelters. And among the women, it was higher. A lot of the women were in homeless shelters with their children, which is, it's not like what you think of as a homeless shelter for a man. They have a little cubicle somewhere in a homeless shelter. I'd say among the women, it might have been 30% homeless. But most of the men, they got a room somewhere. And the white lady I was telling you about who dreamed about the $10, she had rented a room 1 block from the labor hall. And so she could walk to work. Yeah.
Obviously, you must have taught politics, it sounds like, even though it sounds like a lot of these guys aren't in a position to vote. Do you have a perception of where they stood politically?
Well, first of all, those who were ex-convicts, and there's a certain crowd of them who I think I admired more than anybody else. They didn't know they could vote. They could, which you off parole. But the only person who ever talked politics, I talk about him in a book, was a white guy we call Captain America. He showed up in army fatigues, army hat, always talking army this, army that. One day he showed up in a Confederate t-shirt. Everybody just kind of laughed at him. It's Captain America being Captain America. And he was always preaching the Rush Limbaugh line, Glenn Beck stuff, right? Carrying books, showing them to us. But really the only political comment I heard was one morning, somebody mentioned Obama and everybody said, yeah, support the brother. And one time there was a discussion in a car about how the drift of the discussion was, why did Bill Clinton move his office to Harlem? The conclusion of the discussion was he wanted in on the heroin trade. Why else would a white man move to Harlem? And the coda was, well, you know that's why George Bush went into Afghanistan. He went into that heroin trade. So see, you're dealing with people who, they can talk a lot about sports and cars and celebrities, but they don't read newspapers, and they don't know. And it's just what comes natural. One day, one guy came to me and he said, I see you keep talking to those Mexican workers, and they must really have it bad to come up here, don't they? Are times really hard in their country? And I tried to talk to him, and he says, well, whose fault is that? Who is their president? Castro? You see, they don't know. And I think there are a great number of people like that in this country. Go to a bus station sometime. You'll see them there. They don't know, they don't pay any attention, they don't believe there's nothing they can do about it. So you would not hear a dispute about Hillary Clinton's trip to Pakistan. Never happened, right? Or the medical care debate. You're not going to hear it. They're going to be sympathetic to the idea of free medical care because they need it. But that's as far as it goes. They're like the rest of the American people. They've gone apolitical. All right, well, I thank you all for spending time listening to this old man. And